There's this idea, common in certain circles, that with just the right words, the right evidence, or the right emotional appeal, you can convert someone who doesn't believe in gods into someone who does. That if you say it clearly enough, passionately enough, they'll come around. Maybe not today, but eventually. It doesn't work like that, because the way most people come to their beliefs isn't built on logic, it's built on something else entirely. The problem isn't that people can't understand the arguments. It's that belief, especially religious belief, operates on a different layer of the mind. Think of it this way. If someone tells you they talked to their deceased grandmother through a candle and a prayer and they genuinely feel that presence, they don't think it's symbolic, they think it's real. That belief isn't sitting in a neat intellectual filing cabinet next to what's the capital of France or how far is the sun from Earth. It's embedded deep in emotion, memory, identity, and often fear. Trying to pull that out with logic is like trying to blow out a fire with a calculator. And here's the thing, most people who hold deeply religious beliefs aren't trying to be unreasonable. They're often decent, sincere people who just grew up in a framework where belief wasn't optional. It was the air they breathed, the story they inherited, the framework that gave meaning to everything they experienced. And for someone raised like that, who maybe found community, comfort, or even self-worth through their religion, disbelief doesn't feel like another option on the shelf. It feels like annihilation. That's why it's not that they won't be convinced, it's that they can't, not in the way most people imagine, because belief isn't always a choice. The part that gets overlooked in these conversations, especially when someone's trying to make a case for or against religion, is how little of our worldview is formed by conscious reasoning. People tend to think they believe what they believe because they've weighed the evidence, looked at both sides, and come to a rational conclusion. But that's not how it works for most of us. Cognitive scientists like Daniel Kahneman have shown that we make most of our decisions with what's called System 1 thinking. Fast, automatic, emotionally driven processes. We feel first, and then we justify. So when someone hears a religious claim that aligns with their emotional world, or echoes something they were taught as a child, it bypasses all the filters. It lands immediately in a place that feels familiar and true. And once something lands there, it's very hard to dislodge, not because it's so well defended, but because it's not even recognized as something that needs defending. It's just what is. Now flip that perspective. If you're someone who doesn't believe, not out of rebellion, but because nothing about religion resonates as true or necessary, it's hard to even imagine how belief could be reinstalled. What exactly would have to happen for someone to believe again? Some say a miracle. Others say a tragedy. But even then, it's rarely about facts. It's not that people go from not believing to believing because of a new argument they read in a theology book. It's because something shook them, a deep loss, a moment of desperation, or a crisis so profound that they reached for whatever offered a sense of structure. But even then, what they're often reaching for isn't a God, it's stability. And in that moment, belief isn't proof-driven, it's survival-driven. Which is why when people try to convert someone who doesn't believe, especially through debates, arguments, or carefully crafted sermons, it almost never works. Because it's solving for a problem the person doesn't think they have. It's like trying to sell someone medicine when they don't feel sick, and let's be honest, there's often a condescension buried in those attempts. A quiet assumption that the non-believer just hasn't heard the right message, hasn't been shown the evidence, hasn't opened their heart. But in reality, most people who don't believe have heard it all. They've sat through the services, they've read the holy texts. Some have studied religion more thoroughly than the believers themselves. And they still walked away, not because they were hurt, not because they were angry at God, but because it simply didn't make sense. It didn't match the world as they experienced it. It felt like a set of answers to questions they no longer asked. So trying to pull them back in with emotional appeals or logical scaffolding doesn't bridge the gap. It widens it, because it reinforces the idea that belief is a kind of intellectual endpoint rather than a personal experience that either arises or dies. What's fascinating is that the people who do deconvert from religion, who shift from belief to disbelief, often describe it not as a single moment, but a slow erosion, a quiet unraveling of threads. One day, they realize they don't believe in a literal hell anymore. Then, a few months later, prayer starts to feel like talking to no one. Then eventually they step back and realize that the entire structure, once so solid, now feels hollow. But that's not something someone did to them. That's something that happened within them. And that's the key difference. Belief is rarely imposed from the outside. It's grown from the inside. And once that soil dries up, once that ecosystem stops supporting that kind of growth, you can't just plant it again by hand. It won't take root. You can present the most carefully reasoned arguments, the cleanest logical chains, the most emotionally powerful testimonial. But if the ground isn't right for belief, it just won't hold. And that's not a failure of communication. It's not a sign that someone is closed off. It's just how minds work. And once you really see that, it changes how you think about these conversations entirely. You stop looking for the perfect rebuttal. You stop trying to out-argue someone's worldview. You stop believing that belief and disbelief are just two ends of the same intellectual spectrum. Because they're not. They're two fundamentally different orientations toward the world. One sees mystery and explains it with myth. The other sees mystery and says, "We don't know yet." One starts with answers, the other starts with questions. And here's where it gets interesting. When people try to convert someone, they often assume that belief is the default setting and that disbelief is a deviation. Like if you're not religious, you're missing something. But if you step outside the religious frame, it's the other way around. Most people start off not knowing anything. They're taught religion. They're taught which God to believe in, how to pray, what's sacred and what's sinful. And that means belief is learned, installed, layered on top of an unshaped mind. Disbelief, then, isn't a corruption. It's a return, a stripping away of what was placed there. But again, this isn't how most people experience it. For many, belief is stitched into identity. It's part of their family, their rituals, their calendar, their moral compass. So to not believe isn't just about the ideas, it feels like losing everything. Which is why so many people stay, not because they're convinced, but because they're afraid of what life might look like without the structure. And this gets to another key reason you can't convert someone who doesn't believe. For a lot of people, belief isn't about truth, it's about need. And if you don't have that need, if your life already feels full, meaningful, ethical, connected, then religion doesn't offer anything you're missing. In fact, it often adds complexity, rules you never agreed to, obligations you never asked for, answers to questions you're not even asking. So when someone says, "You just need to open your heart," or "You'll feel it if you just believe," it doesn't land. Not because the listener is cold or cynical, but because they already have a worldview that works. And you don't replace a working system just because someone says theirs feels better. You stay with what makes sense. That's why belief, once lost, is almost never recovered. And the few times it is, it's usually not about the content of the belief. It's about what was happening in that person's life. A grief they couldn't process, a chaos they needed to contain, a sense of emptiness that needed filling. In those moments, belief can rush in like a wave, but it's not an argument that causes that, it's need. And for those who don't feel that need, no appeal is strong enough. This also explains why some of the most well-known defenders of religion spend so much time creating intricate philosophical arguments, not for outsiders, but for believers, because deep down, even they know that belief needs maintenance, and that without constant reinforcement it fades. Think about that. If something is true, it doesn't need to be constantly defended with apologetics, rituals, and reassertions. But belief systems, especially religious ones, often do. They need weekly reinforcement, daily prayer, repeated readings, community validation. Because without that ecosystem, the belief starts to wither, not because someone argued against it, but because it doesn't stand well on its own. That's another reason why trying to convert a non-believer so often fails. Because when someone already stands outside that ecosystem, when they've already experienced life without that constant reinforcement, when they've seen that morality, meaning, and wonder all exist without a divine frame, then any attempt to pull them back in just sounds like static. There's a gap in perspective that's hard to even articulate. It's not that people are speaking different languages, it's that they're speaking for different reasons. One is trying to secure a foundation, the other already knows they don't need one made of sand. This isn't to say that people can't change. People change their minds all the time. But religious conversion isn't just a shift in belief. It's a shift in how someone sees reality, how they understand suffering, death, purpose, identity. It's like changing the operating system of your mind. And that kind of change doesn't come from debate. It comes from something much deeper. Which is why when religious people talk about winning souls or bringing people to God, it often sounds hollow to those outside that belief system. Because it assumes a kind of emptiness that many people don't feel. It assumes that without belief, there's no hope, no meaning, no beauty. But if you've lived a full, meaningful life without any gods, if you've experienced awe through nature, connection through friendship, and purpose through your own actions, then belief isn't just unnecessary, it can even feel like a step backward, which makes conversion not just unlikely, but impossible. Not because people are stubborn, but because the entire premise doesn't make sense to them anymore. It's like trying to convince someone who's learned to walk confidently that they should crawl again, because crawling has ancient wisdom. Even if you present them with stories of people who found something in crawling, if they've already experienced the freedom of walking, it's hard to convince them that crawling is the upgrade. That's what it feels like from the outside. That's why people who leave belief rarely return, and why those who never believed in the first place have no interest in trying it out, because if your worldview already works, why trade it in for one built on stories you don't believe, obligations you didn't choose, and a framework that starts with the assumption that you're broken unless you agree? You don't. And once you realize that conversion isn't about logic or language or even intention, then the whole model breaks. The idea that you can talk someone into belief the same way you talk someone into trying a new restaurant just doesn't hold up. Because belief, especially the kind that defines a person's sense of who they are, doesn't flip like a switch. And here's something else worth thinking about. For someone who already sees religion as a man-made construct, a mix of history, power, psychology, and myth, being told to believe again can feel a little like being told to believe in Santa. Not because it's childish, but because it was part of a story they've already outgrown. You can't unknow that. You can't put the costume back on and forget you saw the zipper. That's why arguments for belief, no matter how emotionally sincere or philosophically dressed up, often feel empty to the non-believer. They're not trying to be dismissive, they just no longer live in that story. And asking them to re-enter it doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels like erasure. Because for many people who've left religion or never entered it, disbelief wasn't just a position, it was a process. A process of peeling back assumptions, of sitting with uncertainty, of learning to say, I don't know, and realizing that I don't know is not a failure, it's freedom. So when someone offers a set of beliefs that claim to have all the answers, it doesn't feel comforting, it feels claustrophobic. That's the paradox. What feels safe and grounding for one person can feel stifling and false to another, which is why conversion isn't just unlikely, it's often not even on the table. Not because people are resistant to change, but because they've already changed. And what's being offered doesn't match who they are anymore. There's also a deeper, more subtle thing happening. When someone tries to convert you, they're not just sharing an idea, they're extending their worldview. They're saying, this works for me, it brings me peace, so it should work for you too. But that assumes everyone's mind works the same way, and it doesn't. Some people need firm structures, others thrive in open questions. Some want certainty, others are more at home in complexity. And once you've learned to live in the complexity, once you've found peace, not in answers, but in inquiry, then certainty starts to look more like a cage than a sanctuary, which makes belief, rigid, specific belief, feel not like a gift, but a limitation. So again, it's not that people can't believe, it's that they no longer want to. That's something very few conversion attempts recognize. They think disbelief is a wound to be healed, when it's often a clarity that's been hard-won, a clarity that wasn't handed down but slowly built up, which is why trying to replace it with someone else's story doesn't land, because it would mean giving up something that feels real for something that, no matter how well-meaning, doesn't. That's also why when people leave religion, they rarely go looking for a new one. They've already learned that meaning isn't something you download from a book. It's something you live through day by day. So when someone says, well, if you don't believe in this, what do you believe in? It misses the point. Because not believing in gods doesn't mean you have to fill that space with something else. It's not a vacuum that needs plugging. It's an openness that allows for honest exploration. And if you're already living in that space, where values are chosen, not imposed, where meaning is created, not prescribed, where wonder comes from nature, not scripture, then trying to force belief back in is like trying to repaint a finished canvas with someone else's colors. It doesn't just not fit, it ruins what was already there. That's what many well-meaning believers don't see. That the space left by the absence of gods isn't empty. It's full of reflection, doubt, curiosity, ethics, love. It's not a hole in the soul. It's a different way of being. So when people say, you'll come around someday, or God is waiting for you, it doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels like a refusal to accept that someone could be fully alive, fully aware, fully grounded, without needing to believe in something beyond the real. And this isn't just about intellectual disagreement. It's about emotional landscape, the things that move us, the kinds of questions we find worth asking, the kind of awe that feels true to us. Some people feel awe in a cathedral, others feel it in the silence of space. Some find it in scripture, others in science. Some find it in surrender, others in self-awareness. That difference isn't a gap to be closed, it's a reflection of who we are, which brings us back to the heart of the matter. You can't convert someone who doesn't believe, because belief isn't just about what you accept, it's about what feels true to you. And once something no longer feels true, no amount of reasoning or pleading can make it real again. That's the thing belief never quite accounts for, that once the illusion breaks, it's nearly impossible to rebuild, not because people are stubborn, but because belief, especially religious belief, is a kind of trust. a trust that the stories are more than stories, that the words are more than words, that there's something behind the curtain pulling all the strings. But when you finally look behind that curtain and see that it's just more humans, more stories, more guesses, you don't just lose belief, you lose the capacity to believe in the same way again. And that's not a tragedy. It's a transformation. So when someone tries to convert you back, what they're really asking is for you to unsee something. To pretend that the questions you once asked no longer matter. To act as if certainty is better than honesty. But once you've tasted that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, you don't trade it for comfort. You hold on to it. Because there's something deeply grounding about facing the world as it is, without the promise of divine justice or cosmic reward. Just this life, just this moment. And the meaning you build within it, for someone who believes, that might sound bleak, but for someone who doesn't, it's liberating. Because it means you're free to shape your own values, to live without fear of punishment or the need for approval from an invisible eye. You do good not to earn heaven, but because it feels right. You help others not to store up favor, but because you recognize yourself in them. That kind of morality, that kind of purpose, isn't less meaningful. It's more because it's chosen. And that's what many believers misunderstand when they try to bring someone into the fold. They assume disbelief leaves a hole. But for many, it's the opposite. It fills one. The hole left by dogma, by fear, by rigid narratives that didn't leave room for questioning. And once that space is filled with your own voice, your own clarity, your own understanding of life and death and everything in between, it's hard to imagine giving that up. Not for a promise of eternity, not for a sense of belonging, not for anything, because what you've built is real. And reality, while uncertain and sometimes cold, is at least honest. That's what makes it meaningful. It's not handed down, it's forged. And that's why the question of conversion doesn't really land, because it assumes you're looking for something, when in fact you've already found it, not in dogma, but in depth, not in doctrine, but in direct experience, not in salvation, but in self-awareness. So no, you can't convert someone who doesn't believe, because what they've come to understand isn't something that can be undone with a verse, a plea, or a tearful testimony. It's not that those things don't matter. They just don't change what's already known. And what's known is that meaning doesn't require myths, that love doesn't need laws from a higher power, that awe doesn't need a divine source, and that death, as final as it is, gives life its sharpest edge, its urgency. Its value, take that away, promise eternity, and you remove the very thing that makes now so precious. So while belief might offer comfort, disbelief offers clarity. And clarity, once seen, doesn't blur back into faith. It holds. Even when it's quiet, even when it's hard, even when someone comes along with good intentions and says, "Come back," you smile, because you know you're not missing anything, you're not broken, you're just awake. And that doesn't need converting.